Today on the Cameron podcast, I'm talking with Michelle Stiles, and we're going to find out more about her background and how she got into all of this. But we're going to talk about media manipulation and propaganda, and I think it's very, especially in this time, it's very important to kind of know and understand that conversation. Um, Her website is called Smart Sheep, spelt with an E, which is really awesome. And getting into her audiobook and getting into all of this stuff, especially American propaganda, which a lot of people don't even know, understand, or acknowledge happens, is very important. So, welcome, Michelle, to the Cameron Journal podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to a good conversation.
Absolutely. Well, let's dive in right to the beginning. Tell us a little about yourself and how you got into putting all this together.
Well, about 17 years ago, I saw some corruption locally that I thought was, a pretty small anthill. And I was just amazed, though, at how deep it went. And, as for a power structure, it's not that big. And so, thinking that power, people go to the maximum amount of power first. I thought, my God, what must Washington be like? Right. And so, and I grew up in a small town, pretty isolated, and, you know, it was just a big wake up call for me. So I started to see some other things, and I just had this urge. I said, I'm going to study propaganda, even though I'm a healthcare worker, right? So I just
Right.
started getting books, and the first book I ran into was George Creel's How We Advertised America.
Mm.
And George Creel was the head of the Committee on Public Information in World War One.
Mm.
And I did okay in social studies, but I don't
Right.
remember any of this, right? I go like, wait a minute. So I would talk to people and I go, so George Creel is doing a victory lap after the event. Okay. So he was the one promoting and selling the war in World War One. And so we used $6 million to convince our forefathers to fight in a war they essentially did not want to fight in. So $6 million in 1917 was a huge amount of money, and they used everything. They carpet bombed society. So they used posters, signboards. They did 4 Minute Men, where they borrowed local authority and they gave them speeches, talking point speeches from Washington that they would stand up in a movie theater or at a church meeting and gathering, and would essentially portray that they were speaking from their heart when they were basically having just talking points. They did Junior Minutemen. They did exhibitions. They did movies. They did paid historians. Have I forgotten anything? Like there wasn't anything that they did not do
If
for
it
that
was a
time period.
media channel available in 1917, they
Every
were doing
media channel
it.
available.
Yes, yes.
You got it. Okay.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
again, $6 million goes a long way. And I remember thinking when I read that book, like, holy cow, how did this guy, he was a journalist, he was like mostly a figurehead. But I thought, how the heck did he put this thing together? And but anyways, that wasn't my concern. I mean, it was just in the back of my mind. Later on, I ended up coming across George Wallace's quote, which was that it was a boast, and he is a Fabian socialist from the UK. So he palled around with Bertrand Russell, the Huxleys, H.G. Wells at the time, and he wrote a book called Human Nature and Politics. And in it, he said that if the holders of wealth decide that they want to lower a tariff, raise a tax, et cetera, there's so much art and skill to be bought in the production of emotion or opinion that going forward, all the political contests will be changed. Well, my mouth just fell down because the year that was written was 1908. So I said, wow, I still don't know a lot. Right. And I have to,
Yeah.
so I start pulling on these strings. Okay. And so because I'm a healthcare worker, I don't have to stay in a swim lane of communication or journalism or sociology or psychology. So I was able to weave in and out and just follow the trail where it led. And so that made me go even deeper back into the 1800s and look at the rise of just the selling function. And what I realized and learned was that we started selling commodities. We went to selling events, which was like P.T. Barnum and the Buffalo Bill Wild West. Then we moved to selling the West as a destination, but you weren't just selling land, you were selling adventure. You were selling a new start. You were selling something different than
Opportunity.
just,
Yeah.
yeah, opportunity, exactly, right. And then we go into the late 1800s with McKinley, and they start selling politicians. So you could sell politicians and policies, men and measures. And so that takes us to about the turn of the century. And in my newest book, in my latest book that hasn't come out yet, I share some examples of you know the creative use of this is actually pretty astounding, because you can actually go and sell ideologies. You can sell wars, but literally you can sell anything with that technology. And so by the time the turn of the century had rolled around, well, the penny press came out in 1833, and that pretty much changed everything for the small time publisher, right? You couldn't really run a news thing unless you had about $1 million, because that's what it cost. So
Right.
to enter the thing, so it became really consolidated. It became essentially monopolized, and so you have this creature that's now it's a media enterprise, right? You had publishing, you had books, you had magazines at that time, which were the most of the prominent channels,
Right.
and they were pretty much owned or controlled or leveraged by advertising or ownership. And so, that was really fateful, essentially, to the Republic, because now behind the scenes you had an apologist for, now remember, behind the right and left curtain, it looks like we have a lot of choice, and it looks like we have free speech, right?
Hmm.
And people will go, well, see, we have this free speech in this constitution here, we take this paper. But when advertising campaigns cost millions of dollars, and we only have this small little amplitude on that stage, right? I mean, good,
Yeah.
great, you got free speech, slap them on the back, but in other words, our opinions can't breach um, large portions of the population. And so therefore true leaders get broken off, and really good ideas. I tell people that we have the best ideas money can buy, which isn't a good thing.
No, no, never, never is, never has been. Um, no, I was sitting here listening to you talk about all of this, and I was mindful of something that I had told someone a little while ago, and that I have mentioned off and on, but probably deserves its own video and article at some point. As I said, the way social media companies control our with via algorithm control public opinion. Owners of social media companies have more power than the newspapermen ever did. William Randolph Hearst would piss himself if he found out how much power Mark Zuckerberg has. Horace Greeley, if he wasn't dead, that'd kill him if they found out how much power essentially four people have, sort of thing. Um, and that is not a power that should be located, I think, in private hands, and it
Correct.
shouldn't be located in so few hands anyway. Which I think is a frightening testament of our time. But yes, ultimately, this all kind of channels back to one location, and that is very wealthy moneyed interests. And there are some quite hilarious stories in the early 20th century. Um, in that time and age where it's pre-mass broadcasting, but we do have mass media, and for the first time, people can read, so newspapers become highly effective. And you look at some of the moves and things that J.P. Morgan makes and Carnegie made, and even Gould trying to corner the gold market at one point. Which is thwarted, all this type of thing. The control and flow of information is incredibly valuable to much of what happens financially and economically between about 1896 and about 1917. Um, and even in history and what gets told, and the fact that more people don't know about that is quite interesting. I just read a book recently called American Midnight, and he was focused on the period between about 1919 about 1922, And in the beginning of the book, he comments that most people skip right over these years and go right into the Roaring Twenties and the rise of consumerism and the rise of mass media because the
Mhm.
radio arrives in
Mhm.
1925, all this time. And then we skip right to the Depression, and then, we're into the Depression, then right into World War II. And he's kind of like, well, this history they don't tell you. And I already knew this because of some things that happened in 1933 during the Depression, is that the reality is at the end of World War One, the wealthy in America were desperately frightened that Bolshevism was coming to America. And given the economic conditions and the living conditions of most people at that time, that idea was very, very real. Not that I want to get into that right now, but my point being is that a lot of this stuff doesn't necessarily ever come out and get talked about. Why do you ask that? It doesn't serve somebody's interest. People, don't want to know that Upton Sinclair ran for the governor of California on a platform of collectivizing industry in California, and the only reason he lost is because the movie studios spent 2 million, which in 1933 was a lot of money, $2 million making sure he didn't win. They too bought every billboard in Los Angeles, throughout California. They bought a newspaper. I mean, anything that they could buy, they did because Upton Sinclair wanted to say that, oh, the movie actors should own the movie studios. And all the big old heads are alive. Jack Warner, Louis B. Mayer, they're still
Mhm.
at the height of their whole thing. They'll go on for several decades, and they were desperate. Upton Sinclair was ready to end the studio system before it even ever got started. And nobody ever talks about that, like, no, 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 like that's, these things didn't go through not because people didn't want them. They were successfully thwarted by wealthy interests.
Mhm.
All of that
You,
yeah,
yeah, no, you're definitely exactly. You're right over the target, right? That's when they realized they blew up the boss system when they realized they could just manipulate directly the public. It's like going direct. We don't need
yeah,
these bosses, these messy political corrupt bosses that are getting blown up all the time and
right.
looking making democracy look bad. And in fact, that campaign that you talked about was Whitaker and Baxter. Are you familiar with them?
I am, yeah.
Yeah, they were the campaign, and there was a one of I think it was Whitaker's family members never talked to him again after that because that guy, his brother was brother-in-law or something, was friends with Upton Sinclair, and the way they treated him, they basically went through all his material and pulled out things that would be like totally extreme. Remember, it was called the blot of Sinclairism.
Yes, 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 yep,
Okay. And they would make
yep,
these posters and it would be like the church, he's blowing up the church, or he's blowing up marriage, or they would just take everything out of context. And they spent a
yeah.
weekend just reading his materials to get items like that that they could use in the campaign. So no, you're totally right. And well, here's another thing that your audience should really remember is that again, whoever does the narrative first, right, wins. Okay,
Yes.
so that the narrative gets disseminated by the big money, right? But truth is always delayed coming out. So it's going to come out 10, 20 sometimes, right? Decades after, like for example, in World War One, the Nye Committee, which was in about I think early 30s,
Mhm.
right? They investigated the involvement of the munitions and the bankers in getting us into World War One.
Yep.
Charles and Mary Beard basically said, we evaluated the documents, and yeah, the whole reasons for why we got into World War One are completely different than the stated, make the world safe for democracy, and you know, uh, just that whole slogan, right? Sloganeering, right? And
Right.
so, but the problem is we're taught the mythology in high school, right?
Mhm.
Essentially the cover stories that go, era by era, and so people have to begin to realize that, like, okay, we watch CSI and we think we can know who did it at the end of 30 minutes, and so something will happen in this current time period, and then 24 hours later we know who did it, and et cetera, et cetera. um, so anyways, that's always wrong, right? In a court of law,
Mhm.
how often does it take to get to the truth? It could take months of evaluating witnesses and cross-evaluating them, right? And truth is a very, very difficult thing to get to, but we've come to this state where we think that it can be just dug out very easily. And so, people have to realize that they're getting manipulated, generally speaking, in the current time period, heavily, from many
Well,
directions.
yes, and the I think I think a lot of what people consider American life and American culture and all this type of thing is sometimes created decades after the events, quote unquote, occurred in order to push an agenda or a narrative. In the 1950s, the CIA was exquisite with this in prioritizing individualism over collectivism and communism, and they went and they were not stupid down at the CIA. They started first with artists and creatives. um Anyone who was, not writing a, the hero's journey and focusing on individual heroes and all this type of thing got thrown out of academia, MFA programs. That's why I laugh when people say academia is full of communists. I'm kind of like, no, no, there haven't been any of those since the 50s. Between McCarthyism, the CIA, all any serious communist movement in this country was dead by the time Jack Kennedy's foot hit the podium to be inaugurated. The CIA, and I tell people, like, if you were in the 30s and 40s, yeah, there was a real communist movement in this country. A lot of those people worked in government, they worked in academia, all this type of thing. But with the Red Scare of the 50s, that cleaned most people out. And it basically, in most of these circles, if you wanted to get published and you wanted to get accepted, you could not be openly espousing communist values. And that cleared out academia and has kept academia cleared out, for decades thereafter. And when the Soviet Union fell apart, they started studying Soviet literature, and versus American literature. And the comment people always made was, it always involves so many people. Everything that happens, there's a group of people doing it. There's mothers, brothers, cousins, friends, all this type of thing. Whereas American literature tends to be so individualistic. That's not an accident. That's actually on
Okay,
purpose.
can I
Of course, yeah.
add on that to that?
I was
Uh,
setting you up for the next part of the
yeah.
conversation.
Okay, perfect. You just served it right up. Okay, so what I did is I just followed who was running the campaigns, who was running the big campaigns through the early 20th century, right? And
Yeah.
so there was an Americanization campaign. So we bring in people from Eastern Europe, and they don't want them to be Bolsheviks or socialists. So we Americanize them. NAM, if you're familiar with NAM, National Association of Manufacturers, right? They
Mhm.
were the sort of the voice piece of the industrialists and the bankers, and so they have, I don't know how many campaigns. Again, now there was one in the 30s. They were constantly selling capitalism, okay, and they were selling corporations, right? So
Mhm.
Bruce Barton was involved with big companies, and they were sort of doing a corporate makeover for the giants. They were making them softer and creating a corporate soul. So there were three areas, and they were also humanizing the founders that were considered robber barons. They were transmorphed into like a here they are as captains of industry, philanthropists, uh, doers of good, essentially. So you have the men that they were transforming, you have the entity itself, the big corporation that people were distrustful of, right? The big trusts at that time.
Mhm.
And then the system itself was capitalism. But it wasn't anymore, right? It's not free market. Once the corporations were let loose, the free market was not something that was ever going to survive.
No.
Okay. And so, but all those things, I mean, we are one of the most propagandized, indoctrinated people in the history of the world, Cameron, because
Mhm.
we have been there's been so much money. Like the NAM spent in the 4 years prior to Reagan $1 billion a year promoting capitalism.
Yep.
That's when that rightward shift took place. Okay, but it was also they spent $1 million a year right up leading up into World War II, and then following World War. So they always had American Council of Advertisers also did heavy amounts of indoctrination, and also they were going upstream. Now, what you said about academia, I'll read you this quote. When the utilities were privately owned, right? And they didn't want them to be bought out by municipalities, right? And so they're always fighting legislation, right? And so this guy gets in one of these investigations in Congress, and he says, you know, He said this. He said, to depend on the usual political expedients for stopping hostile legislation is short-sighted. Isn't it better and surer to lay a groundwork with the people back home who have the votes so that proposals of this character are not popular with them? And so what they did is they said, we're going upstream. All right.
Hmm.
So we're gonna evaluate all the textbooks. Right. So there was something like, I think there was like 4,000 textbooks in the United States, right? And so they purged it. They literally purged it. If it said something like, "Hey, they're using watered stock," right? And they're elevating the cost of the utilities for the people. Well, they would get rid of that, right? And so they were working with academics. They were paying academics to write the books. They were getting rid of the people who were not spouting the talking points. And so to your point, I'm saying you're absolutely right. That's what they were doing. They were purging academia of wrong think way back in the 20s and the 30s.
Yes, I mean, I think the frightening the frightening part um about I think the frightening part about all of this is that, and I think what the elegant part, and we could go down a whole thing with, Edward Bernays and Freud and how modern advertising and branding was created, which is a very interesting thing because that's a big part of my business and a big part of how I got into this. Um, but I think the most amazing thing is they've managed to do this and people don't understand it's propaganda. There's an old Soviet joke that goes, he's talking to a CIA agent. The CIA agent says, "Your guys' propaganda is so amazing," and the Soviet Union agent says, "Yeah, yours too." And the CIA guy says, "What propaganda?"
Right.
And, which is
Right.
a very dark joke, because other people, other places kind of understand and see it for what it is. I'm not quite sure how they've managed to do it, but in this country, they've managed to convince people that a lot of this stuff is real. And everywhere you go, you find the same story. Take nuclear power. Why did nuclear power become so unpopular? Well, everyone says 3 Mile Island. I'm kind of like, no, no one died. There was no radiation release. Unlike Chernobyl, our reactors don't blow up here in America. I said, why did it become popular? I said, for a very simple reason. The oil companies funded through dark means environmental groups who already didn't like nuclear power. They gave them boatloads of money so that nuclear power would get shut down. The side effect of that was that oil companies made a lot more money. We built reactors with coal and natural gas. Same story when you flex over into even things like fast food packaging. Burger King put their fast food in foam packaging. McDonald's didn't. McDonald's funded a small citizen group to speak out against foam that was killing birds, all this type of thing. Foam packaging gets banned. Burger King now has to wrap their stuff in paper packaging like McDonald's.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, which honestly, to be fair, people would find it's actually illegal. But there's no necessarily way to trace it. We didn't find out about that till decades later, and that's the creation of the middle class by the department stores to sell stuff, all this type of thing. So much of our society is not based in anything real. It was somebody's sales pitch. But here's the elegant thing that I respect. They made it so seamless. Nobody realized they were being sold. And I'm just stand in awe of they managed to do it. Nobody knows it's propaganda. Nobody understands it's a sales pitch, and we just take it for granted. That's quite impressive.
Right. Okay. So what I would say, like when I ask people, okay, what comes to mind when they think of propaganda? Because right, it's American propaganda is oxymoron for most people. Like we don't do it. We've
Right,
been told that the enemy does it, not us. Okay,
right.
that's the first problem, right? But the second problem is people think lies and mistruths, okay, and that the antidote to that is logic, right?
Hmm.
Or not to be emotional, right? Don't let your emotions get picked up and just be rational, okay? But the thing is they use trusts. Okay, so what is it that all right, so I created this little graphic called infrastructure belief. And what I did is I went back to Le Bon in late 1800s, right?
Hmm.
Gustav Le Bon, you're familiar with the crowd, a study of the popular mind, I'm sure. And
Yep, yep, yep.
okay, so when you pick it up and read it now, you go, oh my god, like I was like, it's so applicable, right? Okay, so I
Mhm.
said, if this is true, it's 125 years later. He must be saying something true about human nature itself, how we come to believe things. Okay, and so I created a triangle: experience in the middle, authority down at one prong here, and social pressure on the other. Okay, so it's a little triangle. Okay, on the top is experience. Seeing is believing. Trust your eyes. So they use visual images a lot for this. Okay, but they also use stagecraft, which Bernays talked about, right? He
Yeah.
used the torches of freedom. He says, like we're just going to create news. It's going to look like valuable information to you, right? And
Yes,
you're going to say,
yes.
oh, you're saying something about what's organically happening in the environment when in fact it was not organically happening. Okay, but we trust our eyes. Okay, so the other because you're asking that question, how do we get so fooled? Right,
Yeah.
that we trust authorities, right? So now if you think back, let's go just a little prior to the penny press. Most of the locations in America were smaller, rural. Okay, and I call it a walnut. So local culture tends to be really self-reinforcing. All right, if somebody comes in who's a con man or a snake oil salesman, it just takes one or maybe two people to figure it out, and that whole community knows, and he's got to move on, right? So we can
Right.
vet this because there's not too many not too many experiences that happen that I don't know somebody who was there, or I myself was there, or they know somebody who knows somebody. Okay, so that's pretty close. So I can vet my world, my material world. Okay, and it, like I said, it's self-reinforcing. So the case in point is indigenous people who don't have contact with the outside world. They could stay the same for hundreds of years, correct?
Right.
Right. And so what about the Amish? That's another good example, right? So they said, well, we're not going to hook up electricity to our homes. And they're essentially living an 18th century lifestyle here in the 21st century. How have they been able to maintain that in the midst of just ridiculous change, cultural and social change over that time period? But they really they just disconnected that outside force. So here's the thing. So there's your little local walnut, very self-reinforcing and very conservative. All right. All of a sudden, the newspaper, the railroads go all the way across the continent. The penny press is cheap enough for every man to get it. It was 6 cents before, now it's a penny. All right, everybody can afford it almost. So now all this information about the world is being disseminated all the way across. And Gabriel Tarde, a Frenchman, called that a spiritual public. So now people were being united together in a way that was non-material. That makes sense. It becomes this
Yeah.
sort of spiritual public that is, one, highly manipulatable because it is not vetable. It's not verifiable to the average person. The truth may came out much later, but that doesn't get distributed on the same wide dissemination channel as the first, narrative. Okay, so the people become really disadvantaged here, but they're used to, this is how they, it's like in a complicated society, if I don't have firsthand experience with something, I'm going to look to my local Esther. It might have been my pastor back in the day in 1800. It might have been a local judge or something, a lawyer. I'm going to ask around, get the experts. But now these experts are all out here. I don't know who they are. Okay. And so these same things that worked really well for a complicated environment, because again, we can't know everything, right, Cameron? We can't go out and know everything about everything. And as society
Yeah.
becomes more complex, um, and if the society has integrity, we can trust that infrastructure of belief. Does that make sense? We can trust that. And we didn't talk about social pressure, right? So if I don't know myself, the experts I'm not sure of, right? I'm going to look around and see what everybody else is saying and doing. Are they all bolting to the exit in the theater? I'm following them. I'll ask questions later, right? And we are wired like that. We don't want to stand out. We are essentially sheep. That's why I named my thing Smart Sheep. Okay. And so those means that are really helpful shortcuts for us in a community of integrity are disastrous in a system that lacks integrity and has designs to manipulate you, because it's literally unverifiable. Do you know who Ken Cooper is?
I do. Yeah, but do it for the people.
Okay, well, Ken Cooper was the a president or head of the Associated Press, essentially when it took over the ascendancy over Reuters, right? So
Yes.
news gathering, you should think of as really different from news, all right? So news is a dissemination, but it's costly to get news, right? So I have to put reporters in every country in the world. Each newspaper can't afford that, so they create a syndicate, right? So we're
Yes.
going to gather the news and then we'll just syndicate it to all these places. Well, he was advertising and saying that they were giving, true and unbiased news, right? It would just be neutral news. But he says in his book, he's like at the last chapter, he says, truth, dot, 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 the best propaganda. I mean, that's just like, right? And he says, he goes, it's axiomatic that the purer the stream, the easier it is to inject just a little bit of taint and everybody fall for it, right? So
Yes.
you have this generally seen to be neutral environment, okay, that is disseminating news that, if we want to swing it one way or the other, super easy for us to do, and nobody's going to detect it. Okay. Like, for example, in the early, writers like Bill Kittle were talking about the Associated Press and saying, they're always slamming labor, right? When there's a labor
Yes.
dispute, they would always just subtly skew it with this term or that term to make labor look like violent radicals, socialists, you name it, communists, and disparage labor, and then give the essentially side with big business. Of course, they were big business, right? And
Right.
so, at any rate, so that's the source of all our news, and it's essentially a monopoly. And he says it's the greatest monopoly on earth. He's telling us
Yeah.
if I can tell if I can tell other people what to think about these people over here, I'm in. I've got almost maximal control. So, and that's really where we are, because in the 1950s, Associated Press took over, and they were championed because of all the excesses in World War II, right, with Hitlerism and the communists, right, and so they were supposed to be the ones that were there was too much nationalism, and they would just get rid of all that and become this sort of unbiased source of news. And of course, they weren't. They were biased toward the holders of wealth, And but anyways, the more people get educated on these topics and understand, like what I just said about the infrastructure of belief, that's essentially sales techniques. What do they do? As seen on, or so and so,
Yeah.
this expert says, and then they say, for experience, trust your eyes. Here's the before and after shot, right? Of whatever it is they're trying to show you, or it may be a science study or whatever it is, and then they go, everybody's doing it, right? You're on that site and this little thing's popping up. It's like somebody just bought in Oklahoma, and somebody just bought,
Yeah.
and that's all social pressure. See, everybody's doing it, and they use those all the time. So we have to understand the sales process, which is what it sounds like you've been hammering home with your audience for a long time. So they should be
No,
quite well aware.
yes, I have talked about it a lot, mostly from the inside, because I talk about
You're
here's how
part of that.
advertising works, how it's effective, here's how branding works, why it's effective,
Mm-hmm.
um, all this type of thing. As someone who does that, I tell people I'm like the ancients would find it very odd that we take intangible ideas that we have about businesses that make stuff, and we actually create a situation where you have thoughts, feelings, and emotions about it. And when I'm teaching this, I'll name off a bunch of names, and I'll be kind of like, every one of those that I just said, you have thoughts, feelings, emotions, impressions, all this type of thing, all of that, and the ancients would find this insane.
Right.
Because in the mind of like the ancient Greek, we've taken a car company and basically made it a god. That's how
Right.
the Greeks would conceive of it. We've
Right.
taken a food company, looking at you, Kraft Heinz, and we've created gods out of it, sort of thing. That, we worship, we have thoughts and feelings about their decisions affect us emotionally, especially in an age of social media where, one wrong thing said, whatever have you, all this sort of thing. And I said, the reality is they're a rich company that makes food. Sort of thing. They're a company that makes cars, all this type of thing. Now, I see it's necessity because that's how this world works. You can't hardly sell anything anymore if you don't participate in that system, which makes it particularly insidious. But it is a system, it is a thing. And even in the history of advertising, early ads talked about usefulness. They were fairly short. They showed you what it did, usually with an attractive woman because sex sells. Even the Victorians knew that. And that was kind of it. Then we started engaging not the brain, but the heart, the spirit. And that, gets, it's like I finally am finishing this article called Bud Light and the Stories We Tell Ourselves, and how, years ago, Bud Light hired this trans person to do a social media ad for them, and it sunk their stock price by a third, because the outrage was so great, and people were smashing beer cans and burning merch and all this type of thing. And I said, well, one, they don't understand who their audience is. That's a marketing branding problem, and their head of product should have been fired. But it's kind of like the reason why that reaction happened is because we've tied drinking this beer to primal things, masculinity, sports, which is basically polite, violent competition, war, to to wit. We've tied these products to these primal emotions. So when that product betrays you, it's like your mother slapping you across the face, because if that is doing that, it invalidates everything else you've been taught your whole life about it. Especially a brand that old, where the grandfather drank it, the father drank it, the son drank it, the grandson, when he gets old enough, that'll be his first drink, all this type of thing. This we've taken water and hops in a glass bottle, and we have made it a part of our lives in the way that the ancients would only worship the gods that way. And so you do get these huge backlashes and all this type of thing, and boycotts and all this type of thing, minus the fact the power of consumption is the only power the public has in the age of late stage capitalism. So it's the natural thing to fall to, because it's the only power people have left in this system. And all of this taken together, and we are getting close to the end. I'm curious on your thoughts on this. Um, it's is I I mean, I think everyone knows kind of how to survive it. I think the next question is, how do we escape it? And I don't think we can. I think we're stuck with it. People are too tied to it now. It's too inculcated into our culture.
uh the system of just selling, is that what you're saying, is too inculcated into the culture?
Well, even just the idea that products, companies, brands are things we should have thoughts and feelings about, that these things are a part of our lives, that they have meaning beyond what something is called, sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's I think we're too far gone. I think the only way to undo it is you would literally have to ban like all forms of advertising and sales. There was actually a very funny Russian movie that proposed that world, which I thought was hilarious. Um, but I mean, you would literally have to ban, all of that in order to get people to break the association of primal needs, wants, and desires away from the products that they buy, which is
Mm-hmm.
the end of lifestyle marketing, it's the end of influencers, it's the end of Kim Kardashian. I mean, all this sort of, I mean, there's this
Yeah.
whole industry behind think this way, feel this way, if you want this lifestyle, if you want to be this person, this is what you buy, sort
Mm-hmm.
of thing. This is how you participate in that. I think if you ever wanted to break this system apart, you would have to end all of that. But I think that'd be very hard because it's gone on for too long.
But I think it's even deeper than just the commercialism. I think because that's like like the left right difference, right? They're in both sides, right?
Yeah,
They're getting influencers in both sides. The whole almost like democracy facade. Okay, so in my second
yeah,
book, I talk about the age of reform. Okay, and so at the turn of the century, I mean, the people are fed up from the Civil War. They're losing, 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 losing to the big trusts. Okay, they're consolidating everything. They're buying up the United States essentially, and they're consolidating it in these corporations. And the people are trying to get. They're like, it's gone. Like we can't
yeah.
we can't, the democracy isn't there, and so it's a really illustrative period of time for us because it's very similar, like we're like
It is. Yeah,
where we don't have anything. Okay, so along comes Teddy Roosevelt. Okay, and they were selling the revitalization of democracy. That's what they did. So I took 3 chapters in the book and I looked at from business perspective, and it's like business got what it wanted. Believe it or not, the legislation that they passed was exactly what big business wanted. Uh, but that's behind the scenes, right? So
Hmm.
Roosevelt comes along and he usurps discontent. Okay, so all that discontent that's over there, he's a decoy leader. He's a Judas goat. Okay, he comes along, he speaks their language, and he takes he basically destroys it in the Progressive Party, and that's, we probably don't have time to talk about that, but
Hmm.
that's what he
Yes.
does. He takes it off the cliff. All right,
Yeah.
and they're utterly demoralized by 1916. Okay, and
Hmm.
Wilson won the progressive vote during that time period, but that
Yeah.
was his job, is to wreck that movement, to correct society at that time. Okay, he kept saying it's not the bigness of the trust, but it was the consolidation of that money. Was, I mean, everybody knew, right? See, like coming back from the UK, after the South Sea bubble in the UK, they banned the joint stock company. And Thomas Hobbes says that multiple corporations that have extended lives, okay, because remember, they were first just appointed for a certain project that required a large capitalization and maybe some higher risk, like taking a ship to discover America, right? Now, one
Right.
person wanted to lose all that money. So they came together, okay? But then it would end at a certain time period. Well, after the South Sea bubble, they banned it for about 10 years because they were it was very corrupt. Okay, and they were taking all the stock owners and things like that. Okay, so it resurfaces about 100 years later. It gets okayed in the UK, and same thing for America. Okay, so again, going back to Teddy Roosevelt, um, that consolidation, or to go back to Hobbes rather, is he said the corporations are like parasites in the entrails of a sovereign, that at
Mm.
some point they're going to take over. Like they're multiple sovereigns, and the corporations will win. Okay, and
Yeah.
so essentially, so he diverts the discontent, and the muckrakers come in, and I think they were pretty controlled actually. But that's part of what's in my second book. So it's like an intense case study on one era that is really mostly a fabrication of, hey, look, we've listened to the people. Like the muckrakers would expose, and it would be timed very synchronistically with the legislation that they wanted to put through. So it looked like, Cameron, the people ruled. I'm going to give you this illusion that the people rule. They still rule, but they did not. So
Yeah.
that was like the big, behind the curtain of the early 20th century.
No, and that dovetails perfectly into the very first essay, long essay I ever wrote, called Capitalism: How We the People Became We the Corporation.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I approach it from an economic capitalist point of view, that problem. But I would wish I learned a lot about the progressive, although I learned some interesting things in this conversation. I had not studied the progressive era fully when I wrote that, and I wish I had more. The follow-up essay is better. Um, because I was approaching it mostly from econ and analyzing capitalism as a system. But yes, I mean the reality is once you have consolidation of money, which is basically a consolidation of power,
Right.
the ability to manipulate society to your will becomes one, paramount for survival, and two, shockingly easy and simple.
Yes. Yes.
Um, and we're gonna close on this one, but there's a Hunter S. Thompson wrote about this years ago when he was um hired to go to this, and there's a Johnny Depp movie about this. He was hired to go to the Caribbean, and as a journalist, and this guy wanted to hire him to write articles to convince the local population that the tourism and new big hotels and all this were a great idea. And in the book, the guy says it as say you want to increase taxes by 9%. He's like, you don't start with 9. You come out and say you want to increase his taxes by 12%. And then when everyone's outraged, you say, okay, let's just do 9, and then people accept it because it's less than the 12.
Mm-hmm.
Now, usually someone like me comes along and says, well, why are we raising, this is why autistic people are kept away. Because we all come along and say, why are you raising taxes to start with? Why is that important? What's the frame? And if there's one thing that I struggle with as someone who does political commentary and cultural commentary and all this type of thing, is people think I'm promoting this thing, promoting that. I'm like, I'm not promoting anything. I'm usually questioning how things are framed,
Mhm.
which is very different. And I've said for years and years and years, the Cameron Journal would be infinitely more popular if I tended to play the game everyone else is playing. But I don't. And I think that's why the show's always struggled to grow, is because I'm questioning frame. I'm talking about issues. I don't talk about politicians that much. They're a lagging indicator. They offer very little.
Right,
I tend to talk about issues. I tend to talk about concepts. I tend to talk about frame. I tend to talk about why things are happening,
right.
who's backing it, who's involved, who are these people, all this type of thing. That's what I can, because that's where the action is. That's where things are actually
Mhm,
moving
mhm.
and changing and happening. It does not very, by the time legislation is passed, the actual work has already been done by
Yeah,
lobbyists, by think tanks, behind the scenes.
mhm.
Legislation is the last step in something that probably started 18 to 24 months beforehand at the soonest. And in some cases, it's been going on for years. And a lot of my right-wing colleagues would say, well, yeah, that's the problem with the left. They're pushing the gay and the trans. I'm kind of like, it's not just that. Yeah, that's a favorite hobby horse. It's literally everything. Like
Yeah.
the action that's happening in how things decide in our society is not happening in the public sphere. It's happening at think tanks, at conferences, all this type of thing. It's happening, quite frankly, most of it out of public view, so that by the time it gets into public view, it's in the packaging and the framing that advantages the people that want it to happen, which is why I say politicians are a lagging indicator, because they don't say anything until it becomes popular.
I like that phrase. I think it's a great way to say it. I mean,
Yeah.
are you familiar with William Carey from Australia? Taking
No,
the
I don't
risk,
think so.
taking the risk out
Yeah.
of democracy.
Oh, okay, yeah.
He's another really good. He said the 20th century has been characteristic by three developments of great political importance: the growth of democracy, the growth of corporate power, and the growth of corporate propaganda as a means of protecting corporate power against democracy.
Yes. No, no, that
Isn't
is
that
my
good?
first.
I
No,
would
that
even
is my
say the
first.
last part of it
Yeah.
is completely eclipsing democracy. I don't say
No,
protecting against. I say completely
yes.
eclipsing. But
No,
he's a good one.
yeah, no, I'm surprised I didn't come across him, because in my first essay, I said when corporations figured out they could turn government into a line item expense, if we spend
Mhm.
X amount on lobbyists, we
Yeah.
can do what we want, sort of thing. When corporations figured that out, and that really got underway, I tracked it to at least the 1980s. It probably predates that, but that's what I could prove. It
I
probably
would say
predates that.
McKinley, going
Yeah,
back to
that's kind
McKinley.
of how far back I went, that where it was really obvious. Because you get, which gets into Microsoft and the rise of technology, and they weren't engaging government and all this sort of thing. I had tracked it back to at least these goes back further. But the point being is that when corporations figured out if we spend X dollars on lobby, essentially X dollars on government, we turn government into a light item expense,
Hmm.
democracy will never touch us.
Hmm.
And that's why, and I tell people, I said, everything follows on from that.
Hmm.
And even the figure of Donald Trump, I tell people, I'm kind of like, Trump's a symptom, not a disease. People are so desperate for anything to change in this country. They're willing to elect a reality TV show host just to see what will happen, because our society has gotten stagnant. That's very terrible for the regular working person, but you know who it's great for? It's excellent for corporations,
Hmm.
because now they can plan out 5 year projections, all this type of thing, knowing in the back of their minds, unconsciously or consciously, that nothing will interrupt that, because they've owned the politicians, they've bought the government, they have the tax code written in their favor, they have the applicable laws written in their favor, and you can now, essentially trade politicians like Pokemon. And that, you
Yeah.
got to collect them all. And that has fundamentally neutered democracy. I remember in 2014 I was explaining this, and someone said, "Well, who represents us?" And I said, "Are you a wealthy business or a wealthy person?" And they're like, "No." And I'm like, "Then no one. You're not a factor. None of
Right.
us are."
You're the masses. You're the sheep to be herded.
Yeah.
And that's the Judas goat, right? You know what a Judas goat does, right?
Yes. Yes. Yes.
He gets in with the sheep and they
Yep.
trust him. Then he'll lead
Yep.
them down the slaughter pen and then he exits right before they go and get their head chopped off. That's what you
Yes.
are.
Yeah.
Not
Yes. No.
you, but you know what I mean? Just
Yeah, yeah,
us in
yeah,
general
yeah,
if we don't have
yes,
money.
yeah. No, no, so like, if unless you have nine-figure net worth, you're basically not a political factor in this country. And what's even, I think, more insane is, like Citizens United has basically made bribery legal. We found a way to make bribery legal in terms of you can give enough money, enough places to enough dark money groups,
Mhm.
whatever have you, that you can affect the outcome of elections in your favor. And I think, and people get frustrated like in the present moment when the only thing that ever seems to stop Trump is the stock market. And I'm
Mhm.
kind of like, well, yes, of course, because that's one, the people he would very much like to be all friends with, and two, those people that hold the real power.
Mhm. Well, at
And that's
some point they're
and
going to pull that too, and it's going to
yes,
affect you and me in pensions and
yes,
little individe, and they'll all be out. The big guys will be out in
of
something else.
course.
You know what I
Oh,
mean? So
absolutely.
yeah.
But the unfortunate reality is, which is why I always joke, I'm kind of like, when something happens, I'll say, well, we'll see what happens, because eventually the people with actual power will decide they've had enough, and then things will quickly
Mhm.
move on, and you will be amazed at how fast
Yes,
it
I
all
absolutely
changes
agree.
once those who have actual power in this country decide something's over. And I think weirdly enough, Trump at some level understands that.
Oh,
I,
absolutely.
I think at some level he very much understands that he's not in those hallowed circles. He'd very
Yeah.
much like to be, but he's not in those hallowed circles. But he understands there are certain people you can't piss off because they will destroy you. You know, they have infinitely much more, and not only will they destroy you, they will make people feel glad that they did it. You
Mhm.
know, and that is a quite harrowing thing. And I, it's very difficult to be what do we do about it? And I said, very truly, I don't know.
Right,
I don't know that.
because it's very
Yeah,
hard, right? Like what you need
yeah,
leaders, and they will destroy any true leaders. Like you're saying, I don't
yes,
get very much bandwidth because I'm saying impolite things, things that the media, they don't want those things known, generally known. They don't want the cat let out of the bag, so to speak. And so you can't get bandwidth on their platforms,
yeah,
right? I mean, and
right,
so and it's like so and we can't so we and anybody that does get any sort of leadership, then they just destroy him in some way. You know what I mean? Who's an
yes,
authentic leader of the people, they'll find a way to destroy that person. If they don't just
and
bump them off outright, right? Which they'll do.
and
It's a
there's a
criminal
very
enterprise. It's a
yes,
criminal enterprise.
and there's a very sad history of that, in especially in the labor movement.
Yeah, yeah.
Especially in the labor movement, you get a lot of there's a lot of history of that, particularly like with Cesar Chavez and the farm workers and all this type of thing. And I told people, I said, I genuinely don't know. And I kind of, I kind of laugh because am working on moving into consulting and moving into other things to, make money and participate in the system, because it is very, very hard to become popular doing the news, and politics is a very hard genre
Yeah,
online
sure.
anyway, because most people are not engaged. But I don't do outrage and hate. And that means your audience is going to be smaller
Mhm.
than it really should be, because I'm not necessarily always engaging people emotionally. And even like when AI writes a title or a description or whatever have you, that might hook people in, but ultimately my content is not bringing that same energy, so it's kind of a little bit of
Yeah,
a mismatch.
right.
Um, it's a great filter, because if people just want to go on an emotional ride, I'm not for them. For those people who are actually ready to engage in information, those are the ones that stay around. Will that audience ever be big enough to support, myself or a big media
Mhm.
business or whatever have you? Don't know. Um, Not yet, but don't know.
Mhm.
But it's a quite difficult, and that's why I say that it's so all encompassing.
Mhm.
I genuinely at this point I don't know how you stop it.
It's got to get a little harder for people, right? I mean, because you really have to have some circumstances that, some suffering sometimes, right? Some pinching economically, right? And I think as we move into where it's like AI is going to take a lot of jobs, and the gig economy, right, is already pressing on the younger people who got college degrees, have paid a lot of, have stuff in loans, right? And they're sitting here going, "What's for me?" right? It's like work for a big corporation or nothing. Like, small to medium businesses are getting crushed. Everything since COVID. I mean, and even before
Yeah.
that, but they're getting crushed, and they're getting crushed even more. I was just listening to somebody the other day who was saying that, people who are selling courses online and stuff with AI, they just ask the AI how to do it. And they don't want to
Okay.
buy a course, so they're 50% of their income has dropped off just recently since the rollouts of AI. So as this thing, just mows down everything in its path, right? Which it's going to do.
Right.
It's going to get tighter. It's going to get harder. And really, I think they're liquidating America in a sense, right? In many ways, they're buying up the landscape, right? Buying up the land and doing things. So people, I mean, I think the thing today is what you're doing. You have to wake people up, and then there's massive resistance. I mean, that's really the only answer. It's not going to come through a political means,
No.
right, at this point anymore. It's just resistance. We're not gonna go where you're taking us, you know what I mean? But is it gonna, can we wake people up fast enough or soon enough to galvanize that? Or is it gonna be, are they just gonna
No,
roll?
I told someone a couple years ago, I said, because I approach a lot from econ. I said, I've read, Confessions of an Economic Hitman,
Yeah.
which is a very old book from the late 90s. It's been around for a long time. I think the guy who wrote it has now passed. Um, and I read that, and I said they pretty much have bought and sold the rest of the planet. The only thing they hadn't bought and sold yet was the developed world. And I said I fear, my great fear is that we're never going to be able, we've gotten to a point in a place where it's too far gone. We haven't been able to stop it in time. So I agree with you. I think there is a certain liquidation of society that is going on. And I was hoping that maybe we would be able to stop it. I had hope. I don't I don't know that is true anymore. I think I think it's going to happen. And I think a lot of Americans are going to find out what many other places in the world have figured out, that life in a consolidated austerity, wealth-driven sort of country is quite miserable for the average person. There's a few people who will do very well in total, and that counts the very wealthy, the people that work for them. That group is going to be comparatively small compared to everyone else who's going to be barely surviving.
Oh.
And unfortunately, to me, I think economically, it's going to eventually bite them all because money moves better and faster from the bottom up. That's the thing about wealthy people is once the money goes into those, it doesn't move. It goes into assets and all this sort of thing, but it quits having velocity. It quits being bought and sold for real productive goods and services. And that economically, I think, is going to lead to a certain amount of stagnation. 14th century Venice, the Medici family was really great, except for the fact they had all the money, which left pretty much everyone else in town with nothing. And this eventually causes the collapse of Venice. Eventually causes
Mhm.
the collapse and multiple wars and kingdoms as a result of that. Concentrated wealth from an economic view is really the worst thing. It's like the breakup of Standard Oil. The people who got shares in the breakup of Standard Oil became more wealthier
Yeah,
than
I
if
know.
if they kept Standard
I'm
Oil.
familiar with this. They said
Yeah,
anyone that doesn't have a plaque of Wickersham, who was the AG who helped get that
yes,
in their
yeah, yeah,
living room, is
yeah,
nuts.
yeah.
And yeah, I have actually have that in quote in my book. So
No, I mean it's but that is a an example of everything in terms of like you don't really want mass concentrations of wealth. It economically chokes growth,
mhm,
actually,
mhm,
sort of thing.
mhm.
Um, and I I was I'm amazed at how people continue to accept it. But the reality is most propagandize people on the planet. So when you look
Mhm.
at it from your view, it's like we're two peas in a pod. I understand economically how it's screwing us over. And then you're kind of like,
Mhm.
yeah, and here's how they're getting away with it. So it's like,
Here's the
we're almost
smoke
like
and mirrors.
yes, the dynamic duo, to be kind of,
Mhm.
Yeah, it is. It's a very
It's
difficult thing,
difficult. And
but
I just think, sometimes people will, throw that back up at me too. And it's like, I would tend to agree with you. We're end stage here, especially when I went back and I tracked this thing. It's like we're 125 years into this massive indoctrination of the population that we just haven't seen because nobody's trained their eyes on it. It's been completely shielded us because it's like, okay, American propaganda is an oxymoron. They really did a number on us after World War II. It's not happening here. There's nothing to see. And so, and then of course we just do that, indoctrinate that whole thing into the education system as well. And so we're branded, we were being branded America the Great up until we weren't. We were being branded America the Bad in the education system. Right. And
yeah,
so they manipulated that. And like my generation, which is boomers, you can't talk to them. It's America the Great. What I mean? They can't see the bad parts of what has happened, what we've done overseas in country after country, and they
yes.
just, and like what you said, what's coming here. And so we're going to get, essentially judged for that, I think. But, and so it's coming around again. And we really have to wake up because, and I don't have anything, it's like, I just hope in hope, you know what I mean? Like, it's, you have to let people know because that's what's inside you, Cameron. You know what I
Yeah,
mean? That is who
yeah,
you are. And so you have to be who you are, right? It doesn't matter what's going to make you money. Yeah, I mean, you gotta feed yourself. I do too, right? But we
right.
still have to do what we're doing because we have to warn the people, right? Because what's coming down the pike to us is not going to be a happy ending. And so,
No, and there's when you look at what happened in Greece after the debt crisis, I wrote about the Greek debt crisis for 10 years. I said Greece is a poorer, less robust country for all these years of austerity. Austerity has ruined the UK. I
mhm.
mean, what it has done to the average working person in the UK, people can't afford to heat their homes. People can't afford to have a place to live, all this type of thing. And I said, one of the problems in our country is because we're so large and we're so diffuse, we won't notice it till it's at
Oh
its
yeah,
worst.
yeah. It's kind of like lung disease, right? You have a big residual
Yes,
capacity, and we've had the dollar is been the reserve currency, right? And so those
right.
things have all protected us, and it is coming down the road.
Well, even just the buying and selling of public goods, the getting rid of departments and trimming government and all this type of thing. One, that's a GOP fever dream from the 50s. Thank you, Birchers and Federalist Society. John Birchers and Federalist Society. But also not only that, but just the when government spending pulls back and that economic force is lost, private business very rarely is going to just fill that in or absorb the jobs or whatever have you. It's not practical, not profitable. Private business does actually very little that affects your daily life. And so it's going to get quite bad. And a lot of people, and when I talk about millennials with my book America's Lost Generation, I talk about downward mobility and all this sort of thing and how kind of all these things conspired together, which gets into globalization and offshoring and a whole bunch of other things that we'll not go into because we're way over time. But yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, it is to some degree we are being looted. It is the last chance, the last place. And I had hoped we had maybe caught it in time to stop it. I don't think we have. I think now we're on the train, unfortunately. And, we're going to go through this now and it will kill people, a
Yep.
lot of people.
Hmm.
And people that, if you're listening to this or watching this, people you know and people you love,
Hmm.
and maybe even yourself if you're that unlucky. That is the current state of affairs, and I am trying to navigate it as best I can on a personal note, sort of thing,
Hmm.
but also
Hmm.
trying to talk about it as often as
Hmm.
possible on a
Hmm.
professional
Hmm.
note. So,
Yeah.
but anyway, we are 10 minutes over the hour, and I usually do 45 minutes, but this has been fascinating. Thank you so much for coming by. Really appreciate it.
Well,
This
thank
is a part
you.
of the show where we do plugs, so let us know where we can find you online, buy your books, so on and etc.
Well, it's Smart Cheap, like you mentioned, with an E.com. That's my website, personal website. I am on Substack as well. And you can get my book at Amazon. I have a study guide. I really like to plug for people. This isn't something that I should teach your kids, okay? But if your kids are going to be, as soon as they're going to be clamoring for a cell phone, as soon as they possibly can hold it in their hand, and
Right,
so to keep
yes.
them away from that, and you have got to protect them. You've got to help them to understand the architecture of deceit, the idea syndicate, Okay, that's been created to influence them in a certain way. And so I have a study guide to go with the first book. The second book is coming, should be out pretty soon. I have a lot of diagrams with that. And so, try to make it as simple as possible, break down these, kind of more complicated ideas and this whole idea, beyond a limited conception of propaganda. All right. The big idea, right. Which is what the democracy is really a facade. And here's how they did it. And so, anyways, so it's coming,
Yes.
that's coming, get on my mailing list, and then you'll be informed about when that comes out. But keep doing the work that you're doing, Cameron. I encourage you, you know, and for everybody out there, everybody that adds their voice is one more voice. So it's not insignificant, but I kind of agree with you. We're not gonna hold this thing from coming, but we have to be ready.
Absolutely. All right, Michelle, thank you so much for coming on the Cameron Journal podcast.
Thank you.
That's all for this episode of the Cameron Journal podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Visit us online at CameronJournal.com. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and I love to talk to my followers and listeners, so please feel free to get us on social media at Cameron Cowan on Twitter, and we'll see you next time on the Cameron Journal podcast.